Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take your sources and unlock the most important insights, surprising facts, and connections you might miss otherwise.
Think of us as your guides, sort of cutting through the noise and getting straight to what matters in the information you shared with us.
Yeah, exactly. And today's Deep Dive pulls from a really fascinating stack of articles. We've got everything from, well, high-stakes political feuds, Supreme Court decisions.
Cultural shifts, local elections, it's quite a mix, yeah. We're going to unpack the key takeaways for you, highlight the stories and, the facts that really stand out.
Our mission, as always,
Yeah.
to help you get well-informed, quickly and thoroughly, on a whole range of topics shaping the news right now.
So let's dive into this material you've put together.
Okay, let's start with that first big one, this political showdown, Trump versus Musk.
Right. Yeah, it's something everyone sort of saw coming, didn't they? But maybe not quite this quickly or getting this ugly this fast.
Your sources describe it as a rapid descent into open warfare, like something that was brewing but just exploded.
Absolutely. And the ostensible reasons, the ones stated, they're kind of layered. You've got the big budget bill.
The one Trump calls big, beautiful?
That's the one. But it increases the deficit, potentially massively. And that runs counter to what Musk was apparently pushing for with that DOGE initiative he was involved with earlier.
Okay, so there's that policy clash.
Yeah, and then there were maybe some potential cuts to EV subsidies floating around that obviously wouldn't sit well with Musk's business interests, Tesla and all that.
Right, makes sense. So you have these specific points, but reading between the lines in your sources, there's this underlying rivalry too.
Oh, definitely. The source mentions this idea of this country isn't big enough for the two of us. They're both fighting for the spotlight for that alpha dog title.
And that tension just blew up yesterday.
Yeah.
In a very public way.
It really did. The play-by-play is kind of wild. Trump kicked it off, calling Musk very disappointed, saying he had Trump derangement syndrome.
And Musk didn't waste any time hitting back.
Not at all. Fired right back. Your sources say he claimed Trump would have actually lost the election without him, without his help with the House and Senate motions.
Wow. Okay, so that's a direct challenge. How did Trump respond?
Predictably, maybe. Retorted he would have won easily anyway. But then he escalated, seriously escalated, suggesting maybe they should cancel government contracts with Musk's companies.
Whoa. Those contracts are huge, aren't they? What are we talking like?
Your sources estimate somewhere in the realm of $40 to $50 billion. It's a massive amount of money, a huge potential blow.
It really is. And Musk's response to that threat?
He reportedly hit back with another big one, threatened that SpaceX might just, decommission its Dragon spacecraft, the one NASA uses, meaning the U.S. would have to go back to paying Russia to get astronauts to the ISS. And then almost immediately after, he suggests on X Twitter that Trump should be impeached.
This is just spiraling. Did it stop there?
Nope. Trump then comes out saying Musk had been wearing thin and that he had asked Musk to leave his government role, trying to reframe it.
Okay. And then Musk.
Then Musk dropped what he called the really big bomb on X Twitter, claimed the Epstein files are still sealed because Trump's name is all over them, essentially threatening to out Trump as a pedophile.
Good grief. Your source quoted Ron Burgundy, right?
Yep. Boy, that escalated quickly. I mean, that really got out of hand fast. It kind of sums it up perfectly.
And the role of social media in all this, it's central, isn't it?
Oh, completely. Like your source says, he who lives by the social media dies by the social media. This whole thing played out in real time, very publicly.
And unleashed a flood of commentary. And memes, of course.
Of course. The internet responded instantly. Your source lists a bunch of examples. The Cybertruck one, buyer's remorse about Trump.
References to movies like Fatal Attraction, the Kendrick Lamar Drake thing, and the one for the kitties meme.
A historical one, the Stalin Yezhov reference about erasing people from photos.
Digging up old tweets, internet is forever, the straight man variations, foreign affairs jokes.
Michael Jackson's Thriller, the You Say Tomato, one about different Republican groups, even a Game of Thrones comparison. People were definitely having a field day online.
But not everyone's laughing. Speaker Mike Johnson, for instance, he's been trying to manage Trump.
Yeah, trying to build that relationship. And now he's got another unpredictable player, Musk, attacking the very budget bill he barely managed to get through the House. The source says he was beside himself.
And other Republicans in Congress, what's their take?
It's interesting. Your source suggests some are kind of quietly happy to see Musk taking the heat as a budget hawk champion, especially from the right flank.
But they don't want it to go too far.
Exactly. They really, really hope it doesn't become a full-on hot war. The last thing they want is to be forced to choose sides between Musk with his money and massive social media reach and Trump with his base and, his history of going after anyone he sees as disloyal.
Makes sense. What about Democrats? Are they just enjoying the popcorn?
Pretty much, yeah, just watching the show. Although your source mentions there was some chatter, some debate among certain Democrats about maybe trying to bring Musk back into the tent.
Really? What's the argument against that?
Well, your source, citing the work, lays out a pretty strong case against courting him. They argue he's actually quite unpopular overall, not really aligned with Democrats on policy. Frankly, the source uses terms like fascist and racist.
Rock.
Plus, they say he's mercurial. His money didn't seem to help much in that Wisconsin race. Getting close to him could hurt Democrats' own brand. And hey, they kind of get the benefit of his attacks on Republicans anyway. And oh yeah, they repeat, he's a fascist and a racist. So, not much appetite there.
Given all that back and forth, the threats, what's the prediction? Does this feud last?
The source actually guesses it probably won't last long. They think it'll likely end in some kind of uneasy truce.
With that?
Well, a couple of reasons. Trump probably doesn't need this extra headache during a really tricky budget fight that's already showing GOP divisions. And, you have to wonder what Musk might know from his time inside. Maybe stuff from Twitter DMs.
Potential leverage.
Could be. And on Musk's side, he really can't afford to lose those government contracts. SpaceX especially. Plus, he's already taking a massive financial hit just from this spat. Tesla shares dropped 16% since he started complaining about the budget.
How much is that in dollar terms for him?
About $34 billion wiped off his personal wealth, and nearly $27 billion of that vanished in just one day. That kind of stings.
Yeah, that definitely makes that kayfabe theory that it's all just a staged performance seem pretty unlikely. Losing billions isn't usually part of the act.
Exactly. It doesn't really track. Which brings us to Musk's actual standing with the Republican base. How popular is he?
That's a key question, right?
It is. And your source cites an Economist YouGov poll showing his approval among Republicans is 76%. That's only 9 points lower than Trump's 87%. It's remarkably high.
Wow, so he has real pull with that base.
He really does. And that explains why you didn't hear many Republican politicians jumping to criticize his comments about the budget bill. They know he resonates. People like his perceived willingness to cut government. He's seen as this larger-than-life figure, a separate power center.
And his ex-Twitter following is massive compared to Trump's site.
Huge difference. Around 220 million followers versus whatever Trump has. It means Trump probably has to be careful if he wants to retaliate. He can't just, publicly purge Musk's allies or attack him head-on in his usual style.
Might have to be more subtle, like transferring people to Alaska, as the source jokes.
Maybe something like that. Or your source details some other potential ways Trump could hurt Musk more discreetly. Things that are kind of in the weeds but would have a real impact.
Like what?
Like really vigorous enforcement of existing laws where Musk's companies might be vulnerable, or creating new regulations specifically targeting things like self-driving taxis, killing off federal tax credits for EVs, batteries, charging stations that would hurt Tesla.
And maybe boosting competitors.
Yeah, like subsidizing Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin to make them a stronger competitor for SpaceX's government contracts. These moves would hit Musk financially, but wouldn't necessarily be a big, visible fight that rallies his base.
Okay, that makes sense. Which leads us right into this whole issue of the embedded DOGEys, right?
Yeah.
The people Musk apparently left behind in government.
Exactly. This is a fascinating and maybe slightly chilling part of the story, according to your sources. The idea that Musk embedded these individuals described sometimes as 20-something hacker kids, or DOGEys, inside various government departments.
Like political commissars, the source compares them to. People there to enforce loyalty or gather intel.
That's the comparison, yeah. And the report is they're still there, still potentially wreaking havoc, cutting budgets, maybe firing federal workers, and this seems key, hoovering up data.
Data from Musk.
That's the implication. Your source gives specific examples. Carl Coe at the Department of Energy, acting as chief of staff, apparently filtering communications. Tyler Hassan at Interior, reportedly having the power to fire staff and cancel contracts without the secretary's sign-off.
And there were examples of contracts canceled that seemed politically motivated.
Yeah, linked to disputes Trump had with Harvard and Maine. And then at the Social Security Administration, you have Aram Mogadassi and Michael Russo as co-chief information officers.
Why would Musk want all this data? What's the speculation?
Train AI bots. spy on competitors. The sources admit it's not entirely clear, could be any number of reasons.
So how do these people get removed, if they can be?
Well, a couple of possibilities mentioned. If the Trump-Musk feud really blows up again, Trump might order a purge, seeing them as Musk loyalists.
But there's a complication.
Right. OMB Director Russell Vought. His goal seems to be dismantling government structures. So he might actually want these DOGEys there because they're effective at cutting budgets and staff, maybe even defying a Trump order if it serves Vaught's own agenda.
And there's a legal challenge, too.
Yes, a pending lawsuit arguing the whole DOGE operation is unconstitutional because these officers hold significant power but were never confirmed by the Senate, which is usually required. That lawsuit could potentially end the whole thing, regardless of the politics.
Okay, speaking of the courts, let's shift to the Supreme Court. Your sources mentioned some recent rulings were maybe less dramatic than usual.
Yeah, unremarkable was the word used, mostly unanimous decisions. The source sort of joked the court was maybe taking pity on the country after some really contentious terms. A bit of a breather, perhaps.
So what were the notable ones they covered?
Okay, first up was Ames v. Ohio Youth Department. Unanimous decision. It reversed a lower court ruling about the evidence standard needed for discrimination claims under Title VII.
This was the case with the straight woman alleging bias against straight people.
That's right. The lower court had required her to meet a higher standard of proof just to make her initial case than someone from a minority group would need to meet. SCOTUS said, no, that violates Title VII. The standard to get your foot in the door can't be different based on whether you're in a majority or minority group.
So it standardizes that first step.
Exactly. It's about that initial prima facie case in the McDonnell-Douglas framework. Plaintiff presents evidence, defendant rebuts, plaintiff shows pretext. The court clarified that first step isn't supposed to be super difficult, and the standard is the same for everyone.
What's the expected impact? More reverse discrimination suits.
Some commentators think so, maybe weakening diversity efforts, but your source suggests it might mostly just create consistency, as many courts already applied this standard. And they note Ames' specific case might still fail anyway because, according to Ohio's lawyer, there wasn't much actual evidence of anti-straight bias presented.
Okay. What else from SCOTUS?
Another unanimous one. Catholic Charities v. Wisconsin Labor and Industry Review Commission, described as very narrow. The court found Wisconsin discriminated against Catholic charities based on religion under the First Amendment when it denied them an unemployment tax exemption.
Why did Wisconsin deny it?
Because the state decided Catholic charities wasn't religious enough since they didn't actively proselytize as part of their work. The court said that's drawing lines between religions based on their specific theological practices, which the First Amendment forbids.
Got it. And the gun manufacturer case?
Mexican government v. gun manufacturers.
Yeah.
Another unanimous dismissal. The court essentially just reaffirmed that a 2005 federal law protects the gun industry from lawsuits over the misuse of their products by other people. They said Congress passed that law specifically to prevent those kinds of downstream damages lawsuits. If Mexico or anyone else wants to change that, they need Congress to change the law.
Okay. Now, circling back to those embedded DOGs and the Social Security data, there was a specific SCOTUS ruling on that just last Friday.
Yes, this is a significant development reported in your sources. An unsigned 6-3 ruling. The Supreme Court reversed the lower court's temporary block that had stopped DOGEys from accessing the full SSA databases and required them to destroy copied data.
So the lower courts had blocked them. Why?
The original lawsuit, brought by unions and retire groups, argued that giving these unvetted individuals sweeping access likely violated the 1974 Privacy Act. Judge Hollander initially agreed, saying the government hadn't shown why they needed full live access instead of, say, anonymized data for finding waste. The Fourth Circuit upheld her temporary injunction, citing major privacy risks.
But the Supreme Court majority disagreed, at least for now.
Right. They lifted that temporary injunction. And this is where those privacy concerns really flare up. The dissenting justices warned about grave privacy risks for millions of Americans. We're talking Social Security numbers, health info, financial details, incredibly sensitive stuff.
And the contrast with regular access is stark.
Very much so. Your source highlights Kathleen Romick, a former SSA employee. To look at anonymized data for research, she needed fingerprints, a background check, rigorous protocols. These DOGEys now have what she calls God-level access to the live, identifiable data of millions, at least until the full case is decided, which could take ages.
What's the official justification?
The new SSA head, Frank Bisignano, hailed it as a major victory for American taxpayers, saying it helps fight waste and fraud. The Solicitor General, John Sauer, argued the courts shouldn't micromanage this effort, but notably didn't really explain why this level of access was an emergency needed right now before the privacy issues were fully litigated.
Wow. Okay, any other legal updates mentioned?
A couple quick ones. Judge Allison Burroughs extended her injunction stopping Trump's order that tried to prevent Harvard from enrolling foreign-born students. Your source noted this is after DHS already revoked the order itself.
So kind of belts and suspenders. The source had a joke about it?
Yeah, something about maybe Trump should get Oprah or Taylor Swift to issue the order next time to see if that works. Bit of dark humor there.
Okay. And the El Salvador detainee case. CECOT.
Right, the case before Judge James Boasberg. This involves men deported from the U.S. to that high-security prison in El Salvador without due process. The ACLU sued. The U.S. government claims they have no control once the men are in El Salvador.
But there is evidence suggesting otherwise. Statements from officials.
Exactly. Boasberg was looking into constructive custody, whether the U.S. still effectively controls them. You had Trump admitting he could get one man back but didn't want to, Carolyn Leavitt admitting the U.S. paid El Salvador $6 million to hold them, Kristi Noem calling CECOT a tool in our toolkit.
So what did Boasberg rule recently?
He granted the detainees class status and found their due process rights were violated by being removed without a proper hearing. But interestingly, despite the payment and the statements, he did not find the U.S. had constructive custody. He said he'd take Trump's word that the U.S. doesn't control them, even with the $6 million.
So what's the remedy then?
He ordered the government to propose, by June 11th, how they can provide due process to these men while they remain outside the U.S. A tricky legal needle to thread.
So yeah, a busy week in the courts.
Yeah.
As your source said, like Batman, justice never sleeps.
Indeed. Okay, let's pivot now. Your sources also tracked some other shifts, university politics, cultural commentary.
Right, starting with that story about Sano Ono, the former University of Michigan president. Your source uses him as an example of maybe administrators treating jobs as stepping stones.
Yeah, the narrative presented is that he was a highly qualified administrator who, almost from day one at Michigan, seemed to be angling for a job somewhere warmer, specifically the University of Florida presidency.
And took action seen as pandering to Florida's conservative political climate.
That's the interpretation in the source. Things like posing with football coach Jim Harbaugh during that cheating scandal, shifting from supporting unions to working to break a grad student strike, using police aggressively against Gaza protesters, blocking student government votes on the conflict.
And that big flip on DEI.
Right. From being a supporter to overseeing the dismantling of DEI programs at Michigan, and then writing an op-ed arguing DEI had lost its way.
We touched on this last week, didn't we? About DeSantis' power in Florida and how conservatives there view DEI.
Exactly. The source reiterated that prospective people like DeSantis, Trump Jr., Marjorie Taylor Greene, they see any past association with DEI, even DEI for a day, as a permanent mark, comparing it to McCarthyism.
So how did Ono's Florida bid turn out?
Didn't work out for him. The University of Florida Regents approved him, but then the State Board of Governors, appointed by DeSantis, overturned that decision. They voted 10-6 to reject him, specifically citing his past DEI work at Michigan, despite his recent change of heart.
So a win for DeSantis' anti-woke agenda, and the source mentioned Schadenfreude.
Yeah, a sense of satisfaction in seeing Ono's apparent maneuvering backfire, given how he handled things at Michigan.
Okay, from Schadenfreude to Freudenfreude, that's a new one.
It is. Joy in someone else's success or positive impact. Your sources use this, prompted by the passing of actress Loretta Swit, to look back at the cultural impact of MA.
A show that was definitely a product of its time, right? Ran for 12 seasons, 1972 to 83. A huge span.
Absolutely. And it evolved a lot. Your source notes its portrayal of race, for instance. It was, post-civil rights, but not exactly modern. Limited Black characters, some reliance on stereotypes for Korean characters, even casting non-Koreans in those roles sometimes. It reflected progress, but also the limitations of its era.
And the show's focus changed, too.
Yeah.
From Vietnam commentary to
broader themes later on. Once the Vietnam War ended, it shifted more towards commentary on bureaucracy, the absurdities of war in general, maybe corruption themes that resonated in the post-Watergate era.
But the biggest change highlighted was its handling of women.
Right.
moving away from sexism.
That's called out as the most obvious and significant evolution, shedding the sexism and misogyny that was pretty baked into the original movie in the show's early seasons.
And two characters embody that change, Hawkeye Pierce and Margaret Houlihan.
Right. Hawkeye, played by Alan Alda, started out. Well, despite being the hero, he was pretty sexist, leering, dismissive of female colleagues. The source basically calls him a walking, talking sexual harassment lawsuit by today's standards.
But he changed.
He did. The show had him stop the leering, learn from female colleagues like that visiting Swedish surgeon about professionalism.
And Margaret Houlihan, played by Loretta Swit, the hot lips nickname.
Problematic from the start, yeah. Carried over from the movie. Initially, she was often portrayed as rigid, kind of desperate for marriage.
But the show and her character moved leaps and bounds forward, as the source puts it.
Definitely. She eventually dropped the nickname or insisted others stop using it. She stopped tolerating inadequate men, divorced Colonel Penobscot, and ultimately concluded marriage wasn't the be-all and end-all for her. Swit herself noted that characters have to grow in a long-running series. Hers changed dramatically.
What drove that change? The source points to the actors themselves.
Primarily, yes. Alan Alda and Loretta Swit were both apparently very invested in the ongoing feminist movement of the 70s. Alda became a major creative force behind the scenes, pushing the show towards more progressive gender politics. Some found it preachy, maybe like people who dislike DEI today, the source muses.
And Swit was ready to leave.
Reportedly, yeah. She was frustrated enough with the early portrayal that she wanted out to join Cagney and Lacey. Producers wouldn't let her out of her contract, but agreed they needed to improve the character, which led to that significant evolution.
So her work was important for portraying women on TV then?
Very important, according to the source. Creating a forward-looking woman character at a time when jiggle television was also a trend. They compare her role, alongside B. Arthur and Maude, to what shows like The Cosby Show or A Different World did later for representations of Black people.
And Loretta Swit passed away this week.
Yes, at 87. Your source notes she had a long career. Our bodies felt MA was her best work.
Alan Alda's tribute was quite moving.
It was, highlighting her talent, how she created the character beyond the stereotype, worked hard to turn Hot Lips into Margaret. A really nice acknowledgement.
As the source signed off, Abyssinia, Loretta Swit.
Right. Okay, shifting gears again, quite dramatically. Let's talk about what your sources call a show of force, Trump ordering the National Guard into Los Angeles.
Federalizing the California National Guard, right? To deal with immigration protests.
Yes. And crucially, your sources emphasize that neither LA Mayor Karen Bass nor California Governor Gavin Newsom asked for or wanted the Guard there. They felt local police had it handled and that this would only escalate tensions.
So the interpretation wasn't about actual law enforcement needs.
Not according to your sources. They frame it as a raw power play, a PR stunt for Trump's base, showing state and local Democrats who is boss, taking over streets in a blue city, pushing aside elected leadership.
Following a pattern, the source suggests, asserting dominance over institutions.
Yeah, the media, law firms, universities, seeing this as another step on the way to autocracy.
And this kind of federalization against a governor's wishes in this context is unusual.
Historically, yes. Your source contrasts it with past examples, like LBJ federalizing the Guard in Selma to protect protesters because he didn't trust local police, or deployments during the postal strike or after MLK's assassination, which usually had state consent or occurred amidst widespread breakdown of order. This LA situation seems different.
What led up to it? ICE raids.
Yes, ICE raids on Friday, arresting over 100 immigrants. Protests followed. ICE reportedly used tear gas, flashbangs, actions your source calls a pretty self-evident attempt to escalate. Trump spoke with Newsom, who argued against deploying the Guard.
But Trump did it anyway, and protests continued.
They did. On Saturday in Paramount and Compton, a car was set on fire. Police used non-lethal rounds. Tensions clearly rose.
Your source mentioned reactions from Newsom and Maxine Waters.
Yeah, Newsom tweeted criticism. Rep. Waters was apparently at the protests, pleading with guardsmen don't shoot, calling it an unnecessary escalation, and saying, the president is working to impose martial law. She reportedly tried to speak with the Guard command, but was turned away.
And Republican officials supporting the move.
Unsurprisingly, yes, taking the opposite tack. Trump, on his social media site, slammed Newsom and base, saying the feds would step in to solve riots and looters the way it should be solved.
Kristi Noem weighed in, too.
Oh, base the nation, yeah. referenced the 2020 Minneapolis riots, criticized Minnesota's governor then, and said, we are not going to let a repeat of 2020 happen, framing it as preventative.
Any other reactions?
Senator Markwayne Mullin on CNN criticized protesters for carrying a Mexican flag, calling it insane. CNN apparently pointed out carrying a flag isn't illegal, and Speaker Mike Johnson saw nothing heavy-handed about it, even mentioned Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth threatening to deploy the Marines, which, the source notes, is illegal under the Posse Comitatus Act. Johnson invoked peace through strength.
Okay, let's shift now to something maybe underlying a lot of this. News consumption and how it relates to voter behavior. Your sources dug into this.
They did, raising a really interesting question. Is there a link between how much news people follow and whether they support Donald Trump? The data presented suggests, yeah, there's a correlation.
Using that El Salvador detainee story, the Kilmar Abrego Garcia case, as an example.
Exactly. Among people who hadn't heard about that story, Trump's approval was 55%. Among those who had heard about it, it was 46%. That's a 9-point gap.
So what does that correlation mean? Two possible interpretations.
Right. Option 1, people learn about things Trump does, and it causes them to stop supporting him. Option 2, people who already like Trump just don't consume much news, while people who dislike him tend to follow the news more closely. The cause and effect isn't definitively proven, but the link is there.
And data shows newer Trump supporters are lower news consumers.
Yeah, Catalyst data cited in your source indicates that recent additions to his 2024 coalition, especially among Black voters, younger voters, Latinos tend to follow the news less closely than his longer-term base or Democratic voters.
How does this affect views on issues like the economy?
Big difference. Informed voters, the data showed, preferred Republicans on the economy by only 1 point. But among uninformed voters, that preference jumped to 13 points for Republicans.
What are the potential implications for, say, the 2026 midterms?
This is where it gets really interesting. Historically, less informed voters, the ones who aren't following news closely, are much less likely to vote in midterm elections compared to presidential years.
But they might not even be aware an election is happening.
Partly that, yeah. Less engaged overall. So if a chunk of Trump's 2024 support comes from these low-information voters who then stay home in 2026, it could potentially depress Republican turnout more significantly than Democratic turnout. That could be a real factor, given midterms always have lower turnout anyway.
The source mentioned something like 108 million voting in 2022 versus maybe 152 million in 2024. Big drop-off.
Exactly. And your sources also shared some focus group data from Navigator Research about how people get their news, which is maybe just as important as how much.
Passive versus active consumption.
Right. Many people don't actively seek news out. They get it when friends or family bring it up, which means the information is already filtered through that person's viewpoint. Republicans hear about trade and tariffs. Democrats hear about Medicaid cuts.
Why do people avoid the news? Different reasons.
Yeah. Democratic women in the focus groups often said it was just too upsetting, like waiting for the world to end. Republicans didn't necessarily find it upsetting, but avoided it due to deep distrust of mainstream news sources.
And social media's role.
Huge. The clear trend is people getting information increasingly from indirect sources, podcasts, YouTube, TikTok. Showing people clips from social media didn't fool the Democratic participants. They knew the source, but it highlights that traditional paid ads on TV news are losing punch. These alternative platforms are where campaigns increasingly need to be.
So the takeaway is that how people get news is changing fast, and campaigns have to adapt.
Absolutely. The landscape is shifting under everyone's feet. You have to understand these new dynamics to reach voters effectively.
Okay, this idea of reaching different voters connects nicely to the next topic. That Democratic strategy debate, specifically Senator Kirsten Gillibrand's suggestion.
Yeah, she floated a pretty provocative idea. Maybe Democrats should time travel back about 20 years in their approach, specifically move away from focusing so much on woke and DEI issues.
Why? What's her logic?
She points back to 2005. Democrats held Senate seats in 13 states that are solid red. Now think North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Nebraska, Arkansas. Her argument is the party moved far to the left of voters in many states, losing touch with those prairie populists who used to win by focusing on bread-and-butter economic issues.
She acknowledges Republican strategy played a role, like Karl Rove pushing culture wars.
Yeah, that's mentioned, but her core point is people still fundamentally care about kitchen table issues, jobs, healthcare, retirement.
And she looks back at the 2006 midterms as a model.
Right. Democrats took back Congress then, partly by recruiting candidates who were more culturally conservative, a sheriff, an NFL quarterback, a football coach. These candidates might have differed from the party line on some social issues, some even opposed abortion rights, but they aligned on economics. And they won. Those wins gave Democrats the power to block Bush and hold impeachment trials.
So Gillibrand is posing a strategic choice, purity versus power.
Essentially, yeah. For lefty Democrats, as the source puts it, do you want a smaller, ideologically pure minority that can't stop Trump's agenda, or a potentially larger mixed-bag majority, including some more conservative Democrats, that can block appointments, budgets, laws, and hold investigations?
So her proposal is drop the culture war stuff, focus on
Things like Trump's plans for entitlement, cut Social Security, Medicare, focus on his corruption, frame it as people versus the billionaires. She argues those are the issues that fly in red states, even if talking less about social issues annoys progressives.
There's even talk of turning states like Mississippi blue.
Ambitious, yeah. But the idea is, with the right candidate and a relentless focus on kitchen table issues, entitlement threats, and corruption, maybe you could peel off that 20–25% of white voters needed to make seemingly impossible states competitive.
What states are targeted for 2026 under this kind of strategy?
Ohio, with Sherrod Brown, Montana, with John Tester, are mentioned as places where this model already works. Iowa, where Senator Ernst made that "we will all die" comment about Social Security, is seen as an opportunity. Texas, with Ken Paxton's corruption, but needing a candidate who, looks good in a cowboy hat and connects culturally.
Interesting strategic debate. Okay. From statewide strategy to a specific test case. The New Jersey gubernatorial primaries. Your source calls this the first statewide test of the Trump 2.0 era.
That's right. New Jersey is a blue state. Harris won by 6, Biden by 16, so it's a good place to gauge things. Will the most anti-Trump Democrat win? How are blue state Republicans reacting to Trump now?
And there's a new election rule making it more interesting.
Yeah, they got rid of the county line ballot design. Used to be county bosses essentially picked winners. Now it's a more level playing field. All candidates treated equally on the ballot, so it's a real test of candidate appeal.
Okay, who's running on the Democratic side?
It's crowded. Mikey Sherrill is seen as the moderate establishment choice. Ross Baraka is described as the leftiest, very anti-Trump IC, even sued Alina Habba. Steve Phillip is running against the party machine. Josh Gottheimer is another moderate, focused on tax efficiency. Sean Speller has union backing, focused on education. Steve Sweeney, former state Senate boss, also union-backed, focused on butch housing.
Lots of candidates splitting the vote, union vote split.
Yeah, and a big chunk of undecideds, 23% in the polling average reported, so it's pretty wide open on the Dem side.
And Republicans.
Jack Ciattarelli, who ran last time, is embracing Trump and leads big in the polls, 44%. Bill Spadea, a right-wing radio host, wants to replicate DOGE and NJ cut Planned Parenthood funding. John Bramnick is a never-Trump Republican focusing on waste. Then you have a couple of others polling very low. Justin Barbera, a developer talking about snow removal, and Mario Kranjak, a wealthy Trump supporter.
So Ciattarelli looks like the likely GOP nominee.
Yeah, based on the polling shared in your sources, he seems to be the clear favorite on that side.
Okay, let's shift tone now to something more personal from that Never Forget for the Record series.
Yes, this was a really moving submission from a reader, JD, about obtaining their father's WWII military records.
What was the motivation?
It was deeply personal. His father served, was injured, but rarely talked about the war. He died young, and JD always regretted not asking more. When his aunt, the last direct link, passed away, he felt a need to connect with and honor his father's memory somehow.
So he went to the National Archives.
He did, and he described the records he received as a treasure trove, even with gaps. It had incredible details like exact shore leave times, but also allowed him to piece together a narrative, a first draft of his dad's service.
What did he learn? Specifics about the service?
Yeah, some key things. His father served on an LCT, a landing craft for tanks during the invasion of Sicily. He ferried troops from Tunis to the beaches at Jela. The records even noted his ship took machine gun fire during the landing.
And the injury?
It happened later, about 2 weeks after the landings, back in Tunis. A truck crashed into fuel canisters he was helping load. That's what caused the lifelong limp his father had.
Wow. But the most memorable thing wasn't about combat.
No, JD said the most memorable item was his father's original enrollment papers. Seeing his father's handwriting still recognizable after 83 years. And the answer to the question, why do you want to enroll? Just simply, I want to serve my country.
That really connects to that idea of the duty to remember from other submissions.
Absolutely. It shows how these records can keep memories alive, not just for the person obtaining them, but for future generations. JD's kids and grandkids who never met their grandfather, great-grandfather, but can now connect with his story.
And people can actually do this, get records from the National Archives.
Yes, your source provides that practical info. There are some restrictions depending on how old the records are in your relationship, but generally, records over 62 years old are public. It's a resource available to people.
A powerful way to connect with family history. And the source added a little coda connecting back to DOGE.
Yeah, a hopeful note that hopefully the archives have withstood DOGE's sins enough to keep providing this important service, despite concerns about data integrity elsewhere.
Okay, and finally, just a quick update on Karine Jean-Pierre, the former White House press secretary.
Right. The news being she left the Democratic Party, re-registered as an independent.
And the reaction from former colleagues wasn't exactly warm.
No, your source cited some pretty critical comments from other Biden White House insiders. Tim Wu reportedly calling her kinda dumb and incoherent on policy in a tweet he later deleted. Another unnamed person calling her one of the most ineffectual and unprepared people they'd worked with. Ouch.
But what's the source's take on the actual significance of her switching parties?
Pretty much a shrug, summed up as who cares. Their reasoning is she was relatively low level when she left. The difference between being registered independent versus Democrat is often minimal, especially in an open primary state like Virginia where she supposedly lives.
And the timing was convenient.
And crucially, yeah, she used the announcement to plug a book she has coming out. So the source frames it less as some profound come-to-Jesus moment about political identity and more as a calculated, how can I maximize my odds of getting on the NYT bestsellers list kind of move.
So political news, but maybe more about book promotion than ideology, according to that take.
That seems to be the perspective offered, yeah.
Wow. Okay, that really was quite a deep dive, wasn't it?
It really was. We covered a huge amount of ground, that Trump-Musk feud and the money involved,
Yeah.
the complexities of Supreme Court rulings and those huge privacy questions around government data.
Looking back at cultural history through MAH, seeing how things change,
Yeah.
that power play with the National Guard in LA.
Local elections, how people actually get their news these days. It really shows how all these seemingly separate things connect and how much you can learn when you really dig into the sources you shared with us.
Absolutely. So as you go about your day, maybe something to chew on, building on that news consumption discussion. Given everything we heard about social media, fragmented news, distrust, and the clear link between how much news people get and their political views.
Yeah.
What does that really mean for, the future of an informed public, for how campaigns even work?
How do we make sure people get reliable information? How do campaigns reach people effectively when the old ways seem to be fading and these new platforms are so dominant yet often filled with noise? It's a huge question.
Definitely something to think about.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today.